Welcome everyone to the next show of CFO Inside TV. I'm very happy that you've decided to switch on today again, and I'm also very happy to have Frank Plaschke here with us today, partner and managing director at Boston Consulting Group and global topic leader of the Office of the CFO. Hello, Mr. Plaschke.
Thank you very much. Hello.
Thanks for coming. The reason we have you here is Boston Consulting Group recently released two studies that I would like to talk to you about. One is about value drivers, the other is about forecasting, obviously both topics that are very relevant to CFOs today. And I would actually like to start immediately with the forecasting issue and ask you, in a world where volatility seems to take a bigger and bigger role and it's ever more complicated to predict what is actually happening, what role can forecasting even play for a company?
I mean, there's a couple of people, of course, who think in the volatile world you shouldn't do any plan anymore because it's not useful anyway. But I think actually it's the contrary. Actually, there should be more planning and more forecasting. But I think it's very important to differentiate between planning. Planning is more the top-down target-setting process, and the forecasting is more the process of where do we realistically end up. And both should probably not be done in a way as it has been done in the past, with hundreds of line items in the P&L and hundreds of SKUs in all countries and regions, but it should be more done in a very lean way on the main planning items and also differentiate between planning and forecasting. And it should be done actually much more often and much more iterative and in much more scenarios, so that, as Louis Pasteur always says, chance favors the prepared mind, that you're prepared for everything which could happen. And the plan, or the goal of a plan is not anymore to have one number at the end, but rather to think through potential scenarios and to think about what would be measures, countermeasures, etc.
Now, in your report, you say the cost of being wrong has actually increased with more competitors from emerging markets and elsewhere being almost immediately at your neck if you're not performing right. At the same time, you're now saying you have to move away from exact forecasting to every point. That makes me wonder, how can you reconcile those two? If you basically say, well, I'm not forecasting or planning exactly on every single item, at the same time, if I'm missing out on an essential part, somebody else might be overtaking me there. How can I reconcile the two?
Yeah, again, I think it's the differentiation between planning, which is top-down, and target setting, and that can be done actually quite lean. You don't need to plan every SKU in every country and every P&L line item to think about a target, which is more top-down, to give an ambition to the different business units. And then the forecasting is more where do we actually realistically end up with, and what can we do about it, and also how can we react to competitors to be much more flexible in this regard.
Now, you mentioned a lot of times top-down already as ambition setting and incentivizing. Is there a danger of top-down measures being away from realism? Because a lot of companies actually follow a bottom-up approach in planning. Why would you so strongly recommend top-down?
I'm deeply convinced that bottom-up doesn't get you a better plan. And especially if you talk about ambitions, bottom-up will, of course, never be as ambitious as if you have a certain element of top-down to it. And I think it's also not either-or, so it's either top-down or bottom-up. It's, of course, an iterative process, but I'm clearly convinced that it should start with the top-down target element, so that the top management have to think about actually where do we want to go with this company in the short term, in the mid-term, in the long term, and have to give that internally as a guidance. Also to then be able to cross-check that with the investors and analysts. What do they expect, and does that actually somehow match together? And only if the business units have a rough idea what is actually the ambition target of where the top management does want to go to, then they can actually much more and much leaner plan towards that goal, rather than, okay, we are boiling the ocean and do it all bottom up.
Now, one final question to that effect. You say it doesn't matter that much if you're then not you're missing the point, basically, if you're not matching your plan. Now, that might be very different with, you already said, external and internal communications. Internally, you might think, okay, that was just a plan. Externally, you might get punished if you're not meeting communicated targets. How can you, again, reconcile those two aspects?
I mean, probably if you have an internal target, you won't communicate that to the outside world, or at least you have maybe different plans of what you communicate and give as a guidance, and maybe what you know you still have as a buffer internally. But then once you go from planning to forecasting, as I always like to differentiate that, but the problem I see in many companies is that they don't differentiate. It's the same, or the plan is directly related to the incentive system, etc. So people like to negotiate and do sandbagging and all this kind of stuff. So it's really important to differentiate these two. But then once you come to the forecasting, I think it's very important to do it more often, to really see where do we realistically end up with, and do we have to adjust our communication to the capital market.
Okay. Coming to value creation, very briefly, in your report, you say that companies easier fall from grace these days. That means if you're not performing perfectly, you're quicker to be going down. Why is that? Why is that more quicker than it used to be in the past?
I mean, in this Value Creators report, as we do it now for 14 years in a row, we always look at the top performing companies. And of course, if you look worldwide at hundreds of companies worldwide and in different industries, and then we always look at the top 10. And the top 10, and there I think we have to clearly differentiate of extraordinary value creation and sustainable value creation. Typically, the top 10 we see in these reports, this is extraordinary value creation in a 5-year time frame, but probably it's not possible to sustain that on a long-term basis. So I think it's always very important, what is my ambition? Is it an extraordinary value creation in terms of total shareholder return, or is it a sustainable one? But if you look at these top 10, then of course, since it's impossible to sustain that maybe for 10, 15, 20 years, that's why we see a lot of changes within these top 10. And for us, it's even more interesting to look at the companies who do sustainable value creation over a much longer time frame, and to see what are they doing differently beyond maybe a peak in certain years, which then brings them up into the top 10 rankings.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. Very interesting insights, and I'd like to conclude, as always, with 3 CFO Insight questions with a short answer. Now, we're in the CFO Insight laboratory, outside, totally away from the real world, and we have 2 companies. One that does a lot of planning, bottom-up, hundreds of lines planned. The other that just goes happy, goes lucky. No planning at all, just take it as it comes. Which one will perform better over a 3-year period?
If the one which does it as it comes is more flexible in reacting and thinking through things quickly, then probably the latter one. If the first one sticks to the plan as it's written down and can't react, then it's probably not the better one.
Okay. Second question, if you were a CFO, how much time would you spend on forecasting?
Probably it would be for me something which is constantly on my mind. If I do planning, if I talk about investment decisions, if I talk about portfolio, if I talk to investors, if I have business review meetings with the business units, this would be constantly on my mind, I would say.
Okay. And final question in terms of value creation, do you think Apple will still be a top value creator in 5 years from now?
If I knew that, I wouldn't sit here and give interviews.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Plaschke. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I hope it was as interesting for you as it was for me, and hoping to see you again next week for our next edition of CFO Insight TV.